Hi, this is Colin. In 2022, we did this show about Rasputin. You're going to hear most of it today with the wonderful biographer of Rasputin, Douglas Smith. But we also decided recently that there are some new things happening that make this show even more relevant. Not in a way that's probably going to make you very happy. But Anne Applebaum will be joining us newly at the end to talk about how it's relevant in 2025. That's Hail to the Tsar. But the reason I picked it to open today's show, which is about Rasputin, is that the primary vocalist there is Zhana Bichovskaya, who is one of, I think, maybe numerous more modern Russian important people who kind of feel as though Rasputin needs to be reevaluated, rejudged, and rejudged in an overwhelmingly positive light. So that's one of the things we're going to do today. We're going to talk to you about the reality behind this cartoonized vision of Rasputin as this just irrevocable and incorrigible, blazing-eyed fiend and sex maniac and a lot of other things besides the mad monk image. There's a lot of difference from that. But the other thing we'll be exploring a little bit here, and I just want to say also that prior to plunging into this, and we did start talking about this show, this particular episode, 6 years ago. It's like Fitzcarraldo, the Werner Herzog movie. It's taken a long time to get it on the air. But at the time, I was not any more sophisticated about this than anybody else. In fact, I'm pretty sure when it came up, my first question was, are we going to talk about what happened to his penis? So that's the level I'm operating at. However, I have had the opportunity to see a better way, or at least maybe a smarter way, thanks to our first guest here. Douglas Smith is an award-winning historian and translator, and the author of numerous books on Russia, including Former People, The Final Days of the Russian Aristocracy, and, most notable for our purposes, Rasputin, Faith, Power, and the Twilight of the Romanovs. Douglas Smith, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we might as well begin at the beginnings. This man is born in Siberia. You went to Siberia to see if there were things that we still didn't know about Rasputin after all these years. He died, more than 100 years ago. But what did you find? First of all, I just want to know, what's it like to be walking around Siberia asking questions about Rasputin? How does that go over?
It's a lot of fun, actually, or it used to be. I don't know about what it'd be like to be doing it now in the current situation, but I went out to Western Siberia, where Rasputin hailed from, to the little village of Pokrovskaya on the Tura River. And there's, in fact, a Rasputin museum there. And I visited the museum and met with the couple that have put it together. They're absolute Rasputin fanatics. And it was really an amazing experience to be there and to talk to these people, and also to work in archives in nearby cities in Tobolsk and Tyumen, and to unearth documents that have eluded other historians and biographers. It was really fascinating. I am someone who believes that when you research a subject, you need to try to visit those places that they themselves moved through and inhabited. And for me, when I decided to write this book back in 2010, when I first came up with the idea, I knew that I had to really try to visit as many of the places connected with his life as possible.
He would have grown up, an essentially unmoneyed peasant, a person with very few prospects in life. But the first thing that happens, I think that kind of changes the course of his life, is some kind of massive religious or spiritual awakening, right? He becomes kind of an itinerant believer.
Exactly. We don't know what exactly provoked it, but he did become what's known in Russian as a strannik, which is a holy pilgrim. And in the late 19th century, there was perhaps as many as 1 million of these holy pilgrims in Russia, most of them poor, traveling on foot over the vast stretches of the Russian Empire from church to church, monastery to monastery, in search of spiritual enlightenment. And Rasputin became one of these holy pilgrims. And I like to think of it as his university, what he used as a way of educating himself about the nature of the empire, about the nature of people, about the nature of God and the religious experience. And it it was profound in shaping him into the Rasputin that he would become later.
Right. Well, you just say something about the name. I read somewhere that the name referred to debauchery or something. Or has it acquired that meaning?
Well, again, there are all these myths about Rasputin. And that was one of the things I set out to sort of explore when I did my biography is where's the truth, where's the legend, where's the myth and all that. And Rasputin, in Russian pronounced Rasputin, is a fairly common surname in that part of Siberia. But people would make a play on the word because Rasputnik in Russian is like a reprobate. And so many began to say that, oh, well, that wasn't his original surname, but that was in fact given to him as a sign of his moral debauchery and what have you. But in fact, he was born Grigory Rasputin. That was his father's name was Rasputin and ancestors before. So that is, again, one of these myths. It's sort of like this notion of the mad monk. He was never a monk. He was never a priest. In fact, the title mad monk comes from the name of a book by a really wacky, bizarre Russian priest by the name of Iliador, who was once very close with Rasputin, and then they parted ways, and Iliador was in several plots to try to then kill Rasputin. And Iliador wrote a book called The Mad Monk, referring to himself as the Mad Monk. So all this stuff got so twisted over the decades and century that I really wanted to set out in my book and try to set it all straight.
But the really interesting premise, or one of the major premises of the book, is that, yes, there are, for some of the moments in Rasputin's life, there might be 4 different circulated narratives about that moment. But what's really important, you say, is not what the actual reality is, or not that that's unimportant, but the more important thing is, how does this live in the mind of the Russian people at this moment? Who do they think is living among them and hanging out with their empress? And who do they think this guy is? That's almost more important than who he really is.
That's exactly right, the way you put it. As I said, I set out to try to pull Rasputin, the real man, and his real words and actions and deeds apart from the myths that had sort of encrusted him. And I set out to do this thinking that, oh, well, then we'll get to the truth about Rasputin, and this will be sort of the contribution that I make with the book. But as I was working on it, I realized that actually you need to always keep in mind there are 2 Rasputins. There is the sort of the real, if you will, in quotation mark, Rasputin. And then there's the Rasputin that people carried around in their heads. And you can't understand the one without the other. And in fact, the more important of the 2 Rasputins is the myth of Rasputin, the beliefs that Russians at the time had about him, because those beliefs about Rasputin that developed through a variety of channels were determinant in shaping people's actions and were determinant in shaping people's attitudes towards the Romanovs and the final years of the reign of Nicholas II.
So speaking of Nicholas II and the Romanovs, he does eventually wind up in their presence. They are, as monarchs, well, let's just say they weren't exactly out there working the rope line, right? They were a little on the reclusive side as monarchs, not necessarily interacting a lot with people. Made for a great Bergman movie, but maybe not a great way to run things. And they, probably Alexandra a little bit more than Nicholas, are very attuned to this idea that maybe some spiritual person, some visionary is going to come and set them straight about a whole bunch of stuff. They've already had a dalliance with one, Monsieur Philippe, and he has actually predicted that somebody else is going to come along who's going to maybe finish up the work that he started.
Exactly right. I mean, you couldn't have asked for 2 worse people on the throne overseeing this vast, complicated, modernizing empire at the turn of the century than Nicholas II and his wife, Alexandra. Both utterly incompetent, not in any way up to the task of managing this transition to a sort of a modern society that Russia was going through at the time. They isolated themselves in a gilded cage in their palaces. They refused contact with key members of the regime, often the aristocracy and members of the military and what have you. And they wanted this sort of quiet bourgeois sort of family, but you can't do that when you're the Tsar of Russia. Rasputin comes along in the fall of 1905, and as the family is so isolated from the millions and millions of people they reign over, they find in him this sort of personification of the Russian people. And they see in him a way of understanding and communicating with the Russian masses. He becomes this sort of channel for them to the people, to their subjects. And this becomes vital in shaping their opinions of who the Russians are, what the Russians want. And they very much begin to listen to him as time goes on, when it comes to very important questions of how to run the empire.
I mean, not only as time goes on, but it's sort of love at first sight too, right? It starts out with there's a holy man out there and they're like, okay, we can give him 5 minutes, whatever. And then an hour later, they're still talking. The next day he's sending off a note, great meeting you, keep the autocracy going. I mean, he doesn't have to work his way or worm his way in there so much as, I mean, they're just primed to have somebody like this to talk to. And we should also say, and apologies for just fast forwarding through so much of this stuff, but there's so much to cover. They've got another problem, and it's a procreative problem. They keep pumping out daughters, which is wonderful in most situations, not so great in a kind of patriarchal lineage kind of situation of a monarchy. They've got to have a son, and then they have a son, and he is a person with hemophilia. I'll let you pick up the story and the role that Rasputin then started to play.
Well, you're absolutely right that from the very beginning, when they meet Rasputin in November of 1905, he is immediately offering political guidance and advice. The country is going through what is known as the Revolution of 1905 that almost destroys the Romanov dynasty. Nicholas is forced to make various political concessions. And they look to Rasputin for some sort of guidance about how are we to navigate this very fraught and difficult time. He insists that Nicholas try to maintain the autocracy and not give in to those clamoring for reform and change. And his role as an advisor only grows over the years, sort of reaching its peak during World War I, right before his murder. As to the question of Alexei, the heir to the throne, the fifth child born after 4 daughters, there's much rejoicing that finally there's a male who will take the place of Nicholas II at some point. And then you're absolutely right. They find out when he's quite young that he has hemophilia, that he's inherited this from his mother. There's great consternation. They keep this all private. Obviously, they don't want anyone to know about it. Now, one of the stories about Rasputin is that his hold over Nicholas and Alexandra is the fact that he is able to cure Alexei from his horrible disease. One of the things that I sort of figured out working on this is that's not exactly the case. They do look to Rasputin during those bleeding episodes that Alexei has. He gives very limited advice on what to do. Basically, let the boy alone. Don't let the doctors bother him too much. That sort of thing. Praise over him, what have you. But what I came away with as perhaps more important in terms of explaining the intensity of the relationship between Alexandra, Nicholas, and Rasputin was that they looked to him again as an advisor of sorts. This was particularly true of Alexandra. She realized that her husband Nicholas was a weak man, was pretty much spineless, and he was easily manipulated by ministers and courtiers. And she was constantly sort of searching for a surrogate spine, to use, lack of a better term, to hold up her husband and to insist that he act in ways that she felt appropriate. And she was always saying, listen to Rasputin, act like Rasputin, do as he says. And not only that, but she would even say, use the comb that our friend Rasputin gave you to comb out your beard before you're meeting with ministers, and that will give you the strength to resist their bad advice.
Right. This is a tortured analogy, but I'll use it anyway. One person I thought of while reading about his influence on the Romanovs was supposedly the only true spiritual advisor who even remotely ever touched Donald Trump was Norman Vincent Peale, who was very much about positive thinking and the power of positive thinking. And there's sort of a little bit of that here, right? Even in terms of Alexei, he's going to be okay. This is going to be good. Stop worrying. That there's a way in which he brings quote unquote positive energy into the room.
That's definitely true. Although I would say that he also spoke up when he saw things going in the wrong direction. And the most famous of these is in the summer of 1914, really dramatic moment in the lives of the royal family, particularly of Rasputin. There's a crazy woman in Siberia who's somehow lost her nose. We have photographs of this. It's in the book. It's really striking. Who stabs Rasputin, claiming that she's killing the Antichrist. Miraculously, he survives, which is simply remarkable. And while he's in hospital in Siberia, he's hearing that Europe is going to war. This is at the beginning of World War I. And he's sending telegrams back to St. Petersburg, to Nicholas, saying, don't listen to the ministers, don't listen to the generals. War would be an utter catastrophe. And then finally, he builds up the strength to pen a letter to Nicholas, begging him not to go to war, saying, I foresee nothing but catastrophe, seas of blood, eternal darkness descending upon Russia. It's a truly remarkable document. Amazingly, it has survived and is now in the
Beinecke. I keep thinking I got to go over there and look at the Rasputin letter.
You got to go see that letter. It's amazing. But there again, like, he was not listened to, but it's one of those what ifs of history. What if Nicholas had listened to Rasputin and not gone to war that summer? How would the 20th century have been different?
There's a lot of that kind of stuff, though. I mean, there's this kind of, I forget who said it, but somebody sort of immediately post-revolution, Russian Revolution says, if there were not a Rasputin, there wouldn't have been a Lenin. But there's also a sense, as you're suggesting, I mean, at one point, for example, he is trying to get Alexandra to talk to Nicholas about turning loose some of the food surpluses that they have while the population is starving, and he's writing these notes. He writes notes. I mean, you had to sort of translate them, but they seem like texts almost. He like wrote the way that people text now. It's kind of like, lots of food here, everybody hungry, poop emoji, LOL, how about feeding people? But I mean, here's this guy who's giving them really good advice in terms of, everybody hates you right now. How about if you gave them some corn and oats? Plus they're starving. I mean, that's not at all the Rasputin that we get in the comic books.
No, and that's the thing. I mean, this is again that big gap between sort of the real Rasputin and the Rasputin of myth and the Rasputin in the minds of the people. Russia by 1916 was suffering horribly as a result of the war. The war was not going well. And instead of Russians sort of looking at themselves and their society and saying, oh, well, we can see the reasons we're not doing so well, they wanted to look for treason. They wanted to look for conspirators. And so they wanted these easy answers to complex problems. We see that again and again throughout time. And so they're saying the only way that we can explain the dire straits of Russia is there must be treason at the highest levels. And they latch onto this notion that since Alexandra is German by birth, she must be a spy in cahoots with Rasputin. And they are secretly sending all of our army's secrets to the Kaiser in Berlin. And that's why we're losing. And thus the only way we can save Russia is to kill Rasputin, to kill, chop off the head of the serpent kind of thing. Utterly absurd, utterly bizarre, but people really believed this at the time. Yeah,
just one last thing before we go to break here. So the most toxic womanizing story was that he was having it off with Empress Alexandra herself. This appears not to be true exactly, but boy, some of the letters that you cite, I mean, letters that she wrote about how she could just fall asleep in his embrace with her head on his breast. She could, know more peace than she's knowing right at that moment. I mean, let's say taken out of context, they could in fact feed that idea that in fact they were together in a less than platonic way.
Definitely so. And some of those letters were leaked at the time by Ilyador, his sworn enemy at that point. I don't put any stock in the stories that they were lovers. She found great peace and comfort in his presence. I would say that she was also an extremely brittle, uptight Victorian woman, extremely proper when it came to these sorts of moral questions. And the idea that she would have given herself sexually to Rasputin is almost impossible to square with all the other stuff that we know about her as a person. Again, this was part of the attempt to slander not just Rasputin, but to slander the throne as a way to help hasten revolution or as a way to force Nicholas at some point to sort of make some kind of a break with Alexandra and reassert, if you will, his manly role as the Tsar.
All right, we are now going to take a break. We're talking to Douglas Smith. His book, Rasputin, Faith, Power, and the Twilight of the Romanovs, is very much the basis of our show. We'll be back with more of him.
God would never bless someone so steeped in sin with such a gift. It must come from the devil. Who knows? I only know I have this power. I have always had it. I can feel it burning within me, driving me on. It is here inside me. It is in my hands. And I warn you all, that I, Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, intend to use it. The power is mine, and I shall use it as I please.
That is Christopher Lee. If you recognize the voice, he was Saruman, Lord of the Rings. He's pretty much always a bad guy, and that's him playing Rasputin in one of the almost countless filmic depictions of Rasputin. I should point out that in less than a year after his death, by 1917, they've got silent B movies about him, but he goes on to be played by everybody from Lionel Barrymore to Alan Rickman, Gerard Depardieu, way too heavy to play Rasputin. He was kind of lean and mean, love machine. Voiced by Christopher Lloyd in the animated versions. John Belushi played him in a sketch on Saturday Night Live, also too heavy to play Rasputin. And as recently as last year, he was the villain in The King's Man, the third installment of that Kingsman series. So Rasputin never goes away in fiction. In reality, though, there's a lot more to learn about him. He's just kind of not the cartoon villain he's made out to be. We have with us Douglas Smith, author of Rasputin, Faith, Power, and the Twilight of the Romanovs. So we do have to kind of delve into some of the maybe more lurid aspects of his legend. And I guess one of the other things that sticks to him, let's say it's not an accident that there's a Rasputin vodka brand and I think a Rasputin craft beer or stout or something like that. He's supposedly this legendary Andre the Giant type drinker. Now, how much of that is fabrication?
I think that's pretty accurate, in fact. Although what's funny is he didn't like vodka. He definitely didn't drink stout, which I think you're right. It's called Old Rasputin or something. It's brewed here on the West Coast where I am. He liked Madeira. That was his favorite drink, and he was able to down large quantities of it. He was a lusty man. He was a man of great appetite for drink, for women. He loved to dance and would twirl and whirl at parties and things like that. So these elements of his biography are definitely true. He was someone who was uninhibited. He was somebody who liked to shock the elite classes of the capital, the nobles and aristocrats, which is also part of the source of some of this myth. Is much of these nasty stories that, he was so grubby and dirty and he stank like a barnyard animal were just expressions of class disdain on the part of the elites for this unwashed peasant who shows up and is given access to the royal palace and the imperial family, and they're jealous and angry, and they lash out with all these sorts of gross depictions of him, which are simply in many instances untrue.
Really pretty bad table manners, though, right? I mean, like licking his fingers and then having Countess whoever next to him offering his freshly licked fingers to her.
These kinds of things happened, and I do think, though, part of that was simply to shock polite society.
Right.
It was kind of a way of putting a finger in their eye.
And we don't have time for it, but I just recommend people, first of all, I'll recommend Douglas Smith's book to people, but there's this thing called the Yar restaurant scandal, which there are 4 or 5 different narratives, depending on who you're listening to and who's trying to make what point about Rasputin, including the notion that he did say he was stripping Empress Alexandra and took his own penis out to show, what he had to offer her and all this stuff. But I think the reason that that's possible, We don't have time to parse through all that right now, I don't think. But the reason that's possible, Douglas Smith, is like a lot of things seem kind of plausible about this guy. There's enough reality to his high-spiritedness, to his lust and great appetite, as you say, so that you can spin a tale and it's not going to ring false.
I think you're right. I mean, he gave people a lot of ammunition at times. He could brag. He took great pride in his relationship with the royal family, and he would boast about it, which obviously did not go over well with a great many people. He didn't hide his womanizing. He didn't hide his drinking. You know, he liked to say, and it wasn't just something that Rasputin said, it was something he sort of latched on to, is that if you don't sin, you can't repent. And if you don't repent, you can't be saved, which is sort of an interesting way of looking at things.
So if there's one more story or narrative about Rasputin that just hangs around and doesn't go away, he's a hard guy to kill. And we know he's a hard guy to kill in the sense that you mentioned the crazy lady who stabs him, and there are other attempts during his lifetime, unsuccessful attempts to do away with him. But we should talk about the actual nature of his real death. There are all kinds of stories about like how many different things had to be done to him to actually make him die, and who did those things. You spent quite a lot of time making sure that you had a good understanding of what really did happen. So tell us.
It's one of the weird things about Rasputin and his biography and his afterlife is that the two books that did the most to set him up in public consciousness were written by two people who wanted him dead. One, Iliador, who tried to kill him on two occasions and failed, and then the other by Prince Felix Yusupov, who in fact did kill him, and then wrote about it in two memoirs. And that sort of established, the Yusupov book established the narrative of how impossible it was to kill Rasputin, that he was in fact Satan incarnate, that, Yusupov and his fellow conspirators in the wine cellar of his mansion on the Moika there in St. Petersburg, they tried to poison him, they tried to beat him, they tried to shoot him, nothing would kill him. And then, they eventually throw him in the icy river of the Neva, and it's only then that he eventually drowns and all this. This is all complete, excuse me, BS. None of it ever happened that way, as best we can tell. Yusupov, from one of the wealthiest families in Imperial Russia, fled after the revolution. He lost everything. He needed money living in Paris. So he began to write his memoirs, knowing this is the only thing that he had to sell to anybody. And he really sort of sexed it up as best he could with this outlandish tale of the murder of Rasputin that presents himself as sort of the Archangel Michael doing battle with Satan in the Book of Revelation. It's a completely fabricated tale. We have the autopsy photographs of Rasputin's corpse, and you can see that he was shot twice in the midsection, once in the back, in fact, probably when he was trying to run away. And the other, what the Russians called the control shot, which was basically a bullet right in the middle of his forehead, administered at very close range. He was murdered in cold blood. He was lured to his death, thinking he was going to a party. And in fact, the murder did not save Russia, as Yusupov thought it would, but could best be seen as the opening shot of the Russian Revolution.
So I'll ask you my lurid question that I alluded to at the beginning of the show, because it did come up at the first meeting 6 years ago when your book came out. So what's up with his penis? Is it really true that the penis was preserved somewhere?
No. Sorry to disappoint. Not long after his murder in the 20s, I believe it was, there was a myth that started that the killers had lopped off his penis, and that it made its way to the West and was venerated as some sort of cultic object among his followers in France, kept in some special little box and what have you. Utter nonsense. And then now you can go to some sort of museum of sexology in Petersburg, and they have something floating in formaldehyde that they claim is in fact the member of Rasputin. The autopsy reports make no reference to any sort of castration or dismemberment or what have you. So again, it all ties into this crazy, hypersexualized mythology of Rasputin that, while entertaining, has no basis in fact.
So I'm not that disappointed, by the way. I hadn't pinned my hopes to that. Reading your book, there's a way in which this is a tale that is located, somewhere between 1900 and let's say 1917. But it feels like a very modern story in a lot of ways. There's the way in which kind of fake news becomes truer in the minds of a lot of people than reality. There's also, as you alluded to, a bunch of Russians sitting around trying to figure out why the war isn't going so well. That seems very familiar, looking for someone to blame for why the war isn't going so well. But I'm also wondering if there are other ways in which you feel as though, one of the obvious mysteries is, why are we still talking about this guy? Not that he didn't loom large in his moment, but we're talking about 10 years of Russian history, basically. And it's just, he's never out of the conversation in popular culture. Everybody at least has some idea who Rasputin is, right? Nobody ever draws a blank with that name.
That's a good point. I think, what's interesting is there's very different histories of Rasputin after his murder between Russia and the West. In Russia, in the early years after his murder, there is interest in him. There is writing about him, an attempt to sort of publish documents relating to him. But then, the country plunges into civil war. Then you have, the birth of the Soviet Union. You have the censorship that lasts for decades and decades. And they don't talk about Rasputin, and he sort of completely disappears from public consciousness. Whereas in the West, as you already alluded to, you get movie after movie after movie, books and things. And so the Rasputin never dies in the West, I think, because it's so rich. The whole story of the utter train wreck that is the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, it's so utterly dramatic and powerful, and it's complex, and the personalities are large and intriguing. I think this has done a lot to keep Rasputin alive. And this question of how power operates, I think, is also something that continues to fascinate us. Russians were convinced at the time that there were what they called temные силы, dark forces at work, that were the true, if you will, factors in shaping the course of history, that the things that we see in front of us, the institutions and people in power we see in front of us, are not the real people with the levers of control in their hands. And I think this notion of people behind the scenes manipulating and controlling fate is something that we have obviously been kind of caught up with ourselves, with all this talk about, a deep state or global elites led by, George Soros, all of it smacking of anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories, and basically just utter nonsense, is something that has resonated here in this country in recent years. I think as a result, maybe in part because we too as a society are going under fairly large, substantial changes that a lot of people struggle to make sense of, and so they look for these easy ways to explain complicated processes.
Right. And Rasputin is such an archetype, that he's easily applied. There is right now in Russia a guy who's frequently referred to as Putin's Rasputin, Alexander Dugin. He's a fascist geopolitical philosopher who likes the Nazi part of Heidegger and believes in all these eschatological movements and stuff. He seems like a much more toxic person, actually, than Rasputin. But there's a way in which, and we'll probably have to end here, but it's kind of like the line in Hamilton about who lives, who dies, who tells your story. Even while you're living, who's telling your story and how becomes incredibly important in terms of defining you. And it seemed like Rasputin, even while alive, was this kind of all-purpose tool for almost any kind of argument. He's corrupting our beloved Romanovs. No, he's proof of how decadent the Romanovs really are. And on and on. Whoever's talking at that moment can use Rasputin as proof of something bad, even if it might be a total counter-narrative to the last thing somebody else said.
I would agree. And I think, the one word that eventually came to me after working on this, scapegoat. Mm-hmm. He became a very convenient scapegoat for people of different political beliefs and persuasions. He became a shorthand way of explaining all of the problems and not only that, but of putting them on his shoulders.
All right, we're going to stop there, although I could talk a lot more. It's a great book, Rasputin, Faith, Power, and the Twilight of the Romanovs. Douglas Smith, thank you for your time. We'll be back with a brand new interview with Anne Applebaum after this.
Then I opened my eyes and the nightmare was me! I was once the most mystical man in all Russia.
Time to say some thank yous. These are complicated because we're kind of merging some old content with some new content. So the originator of this show as a producer was Julia Pistel. Kat Pastor was the tech producer on that part of the show, the Douglas Smith part of the show that you just heard. And then this new thing that we're doing, the technical producer is the maestro, Dylan Reyes, and the producer is our senior producer, Lily Tyson. I hope that's not too complicated. Joining us now is someone who actually quotes Douglas Smith in the relevant article, the one that we're going to talk about right now. But Anne Applebaum is staff writer at The Atlantic, also senior fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University and the School of Advanced International Studies. She's written many books. The latest is Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. Most relevantly for our conversation, she recently wrote for The Atlantic, The New Rasputins, Anti-Science Mysticism is Enabling Autocracy Around the Globe. Anne Applebaum, welcome to our show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You begin your piece in The Atlantic with a description of someone who, frankly, I'd never heard of before. Actually, it's really a couple. It's a couple, a political couple, a power couple in Romania, the Georgescus. Tell our audience about them.
So Colin Georgescu is somebody who was an obscure figure, not well known, not a part of mainstream politics in Romania, who began a couple years ago producing videos, audio, but mostly on YouTube and on TikTok, videos about health and water and natural living. There's a famous one that shows him diving into a pond in what appears to be a snowy day, so it must be a very cold pond. And there's a voiceover about, I don't need any medicine to do this. It's just my health and my belief in God and my spirituality. This is what keeps me safe and keeps me healthy. What he also means is that he doesn't need vaccines, he doesn't need medicines, he doesn't need the medical establishment. This is one of his themes. Another one of his themes is that ordinary people are being manipulated. There's a video of him that just shows hands holding a puppet string and him talking in the background. His wife is also a kind of spiritual healer who also puts out material about health and biological imbalances. And the two of them together began to acquire a very big internet presence. And some months ago, late last year, he ran for president of Romania. Didn't appear in any of the opinion polls. Nobody said they were voting for him. Towards the very end of the election, his name began to appear a bit more. He appeared on very few national public debates, wasn't part of any mainstream media, and also claims that he wasn't spending money on his election campaign. He won. Romania has a 2-round election system, and he won the first round. So that didn't make him president, but it meant that he went into the second round. And to the shock of everybody, it turned out that many people had voted for him. And the reason his campaign hadn't been noticed was it was run entirely on TikTok. And it also turned out that someone had paid some hundreds of thousands of dollars to TikTok to promote these health videos. On further examination, it turns out that he's not just interested in health, he's also interested in what you can really only call far-right or fascist ideology. He praises Romania's wartime era fascist leaders. He's been in touch with Alexander Dugin, who is a kind of former guru of President Putin, who also uses, historically fascist language to talk about the world. And he's somehow emerged as a figure talking about the spiritual nature of the nation, the importance of health, all these things mushed together. And as I said, those were the messages that won the election. A Romanian court has overturned the election because he broke the electoral laws of Romania. You're not allowed to spend money that you don't declare. But of course, that's caused a huge, an enormous backlash and a lot of distress in Romania. But watching that saga play out, he, of course, reminded me of a lot of other people. And my article is about the coming together of several different strands of sort of online activity. And one is the anti-vax health wellness world with the world of far right, the mystical spiritual nature of the nation, the superiority of our particular nation, the questioning of science, but also democratic laws, the democratic political systems. Those are beginning to come together. He impersonates it, but of course, as I'm sure we'll get to, there are figures in American public life who are melding these different worlds together in the same way.
Yeah, reading the piece, I thought, and you used the term, you coined the term new obscurantism to describe some of this. I was also thinking about the term we have here in the U.S. to a certain degree, conspirituality, which is often used to describe the syncretism of New Age spirituality and right-wing conspiracy. The idea that the woman on the yoga mat next to you with her kombucha is on the dark side of the moon shaking hands with a January 6th rioter, that because they've rejected so many traditional sources of authority, they share that. They share a sense that, an argument can be made for any particular point of view, and the points of view that represent authorities are the ones that they enjoy the most. But what seems to come with that, and it's hard not to hear RFK in some of the stuff that you quote from Georgescu, is that idea of almost magical thinking about reality. And I guess that's why we're incorporating this into a show about Rasputin. But say a little bit more about how you think about that. There seems to be a really unnerving global rejection of scientific orthodoxy and a whole bunch of other things that trail along with it.
Yeah, no, so the Georgescu story appealed to me because it shows the global nature of the problem. I mean, it's something that you can see, obviously, in the U.S. In the piece, I write a little bit about how many of the appointees to Trump's cabinet are people who you would not call right-wing or conservative in any traditional way. They're people who sometimes come from the left or come from the world of spirituality or come from other worlds. And what unifies them is nothing that you could describe as right-wing or left-wing thinking. It's more something new, and that's why I use this expression, the new obscurantism. And they collectively, whether it's Tulsi Gabbard or whether it's RFK Jr. Or whether it's Kash Patel or maybe even whether it's Trump himself, they are people who reject the idea that scientists know something. They also reject traditional methods of establishing what's true and what's not true, whether scientific or journalistic or academic. They bring together, as I said, strands of the far left and the far right, if those terms even mean anything anymore. And actually, one of the things I question in the piece is whether or not they do. And they have a kind of political philosophy that is based on almost the worship of personal charisma and personalized politics. You should believe me because you are my follower. I'm your influencer, and therefore I have good ideas, and not necessarily because I have proven something or I know something or I've been through a political process. And that personalized form of politics is what I think we're about to see quite a lot of. And it goes along with other moments in history when people have abandoned the rule of law and they've abandoned, procedural ways of making decisions in favor of charismatic personalities and so on. And hence the link in my mind to Rasputin. You could, of course, pick other, there are other moments in history when people have made those similar kinds of leaps. You could even talk about the 1930s in Germany, but certainly the very end of the Russian Empire, which is a moment when people were, everything was in question, and there was an enormous amount of change, and people were questioning the legitimacy and the capability of the Tsar, the ruling family who'd been running Russia for many years. And people were talking about, there was a common expression then about dark forces controlling public life.
Well, can I just maybe map one other thing onto this? And I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. But so I interviewed Douglas Smith, I think 22 maybe, so a lot of things have happened since then. But certainly one of the narratives, we should say, first of all, that magic is increasingly introduced into a lot of these kinds of narratives, and you certainly look at QAnon, which has a QAnon shaman, the guy with the horns on January 6th. There's this kind of sense of magic, and one of the magical things projected onto Rasputin was this idea that he was unkillable. And, when Trump took that bullet to the ear, that grazed his ear in Pennsylvania, I remember thinking at the time, oh my God, we just got a trope that actually is a rather familiar trope, if you think back across history, that this guy cannot be killed for what is sort of putatively or implied magical reasons. But say a little bit more about how you see that.
I mean, throughout history, people have imputed magical powers to other people, and that has always given them the ability to transgress. And, in the case of Rasputin, somebody who came from an obscure part of the Russian countryside was given access to the royal palace, to the empress, to her children. He was supposed to have the magical ability to cure her son who had hemophilia. And yes, all kinds of conspiracy theories and energy and madness attached to him for that reason. And I think you're right. There is something like that about Trump. Trump has repeatedly broken the law. He has repeatedly committed fraud. He has repeatedly lied. He has, and these things aren't even controversial. He staged an insurrection on January the 6th, and we've just had the publication of a report that describes once again the things that he did that day to encourage the insurrection and so on, most of which we already knew. And yet he continues to get away with it, and he continues to be not punished by the system. And I think that gives him a kind of magical power.
Yeah, you're kind of describing a situation where, in terms of public discourse, whether it's in Romania or Hungary or the U.S. or Venezuela, there's some way in which not terribly rationally defended, non-empirical, quasi-magical thinking operates on a fairly level playing field with scientific orthodoxy and empiricism. And I don't know, is there an easy explanation for why this? I mean, it's always been kind of a sub-narrative, but it's not a sub-narrative anymore. It's kind of the narrative, the clash between these two empirical systems. I don't know. Any thoughts about why that's happening right now?
I mean, I don't think it's very difficult to find the source in the nature of not just social media, but the internet more broadly. I mean, for better and for worse, the consensus about how we know what isn't true changed, and again, both social media and in different ways, the internet gave power to people who are charismatics, and they developed an alternative value system, and that's now competing with the old value system, which was based on, as I said, the rule of law, empirical observation, description, fact checking, whatever terms you want to use, and I think that most of the explanation lies in that. I mean, there's one other thing, I suppose, which is the rapidity of change. This is what we also have in common with the late Russian Empire. Things change very fast. The economic change, demographic change, social change, and in moments of change, people often look for simpler explanations. They want one person in charge. They want one set of ideas to believe in. They don't want any more competition of ideas. And I think that may be the era that we're entering into.
All right. Well, I have to go crawl into a corner and have a good cry. But meanwhile, thank you, Ann Applebaum, a writer, scholar. Your piece for The Atlantic, The New Rasputins, was the reason we had you on today. Latest book is Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. Thank you for the work that you do and for your time. To the rest of you, thank you very much for listening today. Now you can go have a good cry in the corner, too.